All right, I think we're going to begin as people continue to trickle in. Thank you all for joining us this evening. My name is Nikki Freeman, and I am the Director of Education at the Holocaust Memorial, Miami Beach. Thank you all for joining us tonight for our virtual event, Antisemitism on the Internet and Social Media. Before we get started, I just want to remind everyone that we have a community-wide event coming up on May 1st at 6 p.m. For Yom HaShoah. It will be at the memorial and also streamed online. So be on the lookout for more information about that. So now turning to tonight's program, it is my honor to introduce Jessica Katz, who is the incoming chair of the Holocaust Memorial. Jessica?
Hello, thanks for having me. On behalf of the Holocaust Memorial in Miami Beach and the Zachor Society, I'm pleased to welcome you all to the third session of our ongoing series, Exploring Contemporary Anti-Semitism. During our last session, we learned about anti-Semitism disguised as anti-Zionism and how even legitimate criticism of Israel's government can become the fuel for Jew hatred. This evening, we continue to think about how this kind of anti-Semitism presents itself on the internet and on social media with our guests, Mark Weitzman and Dr. Michael Berenbaum. While the internet has provided a megaphone for individuals to express anti-Semitism, social networks also offer mutual support and foster a sense of community among Jews. Together, we will discuss how to present the transmission of anti-Semitism, Holocaust distortion, and misinformation online. I want to extend a special welcome to the members of the Holocaust Memorial Miami Beach Zachor Society. I see a couple of you on here, whose support provides funding on an annual basis that ensures the continuity of the educational programs and initiatives at the memorial and its work throughout our community. Please welcome Mark Weitzman, the Chief Operating Officer of the World Jewish Restitution Organization and a member of the official US delegation to the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance. And of course, our old friend, Dr. Michael Berenbaum, Director of the Siggy Ziering Institute and Professor of Jewish Studies at the American Jewish University in Los Angeles. Thanks for being with us tonight.
Thank you very much, Jessica. Mark, thank you very much for joining us. Let me say a couple of things about Mark Weitzman. I'm going to ask you two questions. Number one, what does the World Jewish Restitution Organization do? And secondly, what does IRA do? But I want to say that you're particularly credentialed in this because you've been writing about this issue for the past 2 decades. You wrote an article entitled "The Internet is Sought Aspects of Online Anti-Semites." And you also wrote, and that was in 2001, and you also wrote a decade ago, Anti-Semitism and Terrorism on the Electronic Highway, and that was more than a decade ago. And one can only say that the use of the internet has only intensified enormously since then. But to tell us for 1 second before we get on our topic, and let me give one background. When I gave a general introduction to anti-Semitism, I said that we have 2 aspects that are unique at this moment that we've never had before. The first is that everybody has a megaphone, and the megaphone is the internet. And furthermore, we can no longer imagine quarantining the anti-Semite because there are social support net. There's tremendous urgency to our discussion this evening about the question of anti-Semitism on the internet. Well, Mark, let's give you a very tough question. What does the WJRO do? And then tell us for a moment, because this directly relates to anti-Semitism, tell us a little bit about what IRA does, the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance.
Thank you, Michael. It's always a pleasure to be talking to you. Our conversations have been going on for quite a long time, and they're always enjoyable. So thanks for the invitation. And thank you, Jessica, and to Sharon as well for really putting on this program, which I think is timely and important. And again, I appreciate the invitation to join you virtually for it. The WJRO is the World Jewish Restitution Organization, which really is the arm of the international Jewish community that tries to negotiate and restore Jewish property that was stolen during the Holocaust from the countries that emerged out of the former Soviet Union and communist world in the late 1990s. So we really deal with essentially all the European countries outside of Germany and Austria, which the Claims Conference really focuses on. And we deal with about 17 other countries. We've now actually been working on places like Luxembourg and Western Europe as well. So we are representing about 14 different Jewish organizations, and we are the legal and moral voice of world Jewry in trying to recover the stolen property. At the same time, what has become more and more apparent to us in recent years, particularly in the last year or so, is the necessity to be involved in combating Holocaust distortion. Because if we don't have recognition of what really happened, who were the victims, what was stolen from them, what was taken from them, who did it, who was responsible, and where that property ended up today, then there could be no discussion of restitution to begin with. So it is becoming more and more important to us to be dealing with combating Holocaust denial directly. So I hope that's a short enough answer to start with that one. But IRA is also a very important organization in dealing with this work. IRA stands for the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, which is 20 years old essentially these days. It was started in 2000 growing out of the 1998 Washington Assets Conference, and where 5 countries got together to discuss furthering issues related to the recovery of Holocaust stolen assets during the Holocaust, as well as Holocaust education. IRA has subsequently grown to over 35 countries, about 35 countries. It is composed, and this is unique, it is the only intergovernmental organization devoted solely to issues related to the Holocaust. It has nothing else on its agenda. It has a diplomatic and political presence. It's membership is officially requested by either head of state or secretary or foreign minister of countries. And the delegations and IRA memberships, national delegations, are composed of experts, academics, museums, and memorial staff, and so on, along with the political level. And perhaps IRA's 2 most noteworthy achievements that I've been directly involved with are the the working definition of Holocaust denial and distortion, which was passed in 2013, and I was actually the lead author of that, and that was the basis of the UN's resolution this past January to condemn Holocaust denial and distortion, and the working definition of anti-Semitism, which was adopted in 2016 under the Romanian chairmanship, and has subsequently been adopted by over 35 countries, and I think it's close to 900 different organizations in 20 states of the US as well, and it's become the most prominent and most widely accepted definition, the only one with formal status of anti-Semitism in today's world. So it's a prime tool in creating a common baseline to combat anti-Semitism in today's world.
Okay, first of all, thank you. Secondly, that's the clearest definition of both organizations that I've heard, and it's one that has to be appreciated. We're about to sit down at Passover Seder in a couple of weeks. We're going to ask, why is this night different from all others? And that's going to be asked by the youngest child. But we have to ask the question, what do the social networks and what does the internet do? Why is this anti-Semitism different from all previous manifestations? Because of the tools that are involved and the capacities that are involved. And you've been studying this for the last several decades, and you've seen it in the United States, you've seen it abroad, you've seen it in your diplomatic work. Why does this differ, and how does it differ?
Well, I love the way you led into that by referencing the Seder from Passover with the youngest child, because in many ways, I think that whether accidentally or consciously or unconsciously, you actually stumbled on something right there, because it is a tool. Social media, the internet, among other things, is a young person's tool. It's not really our generation's tool. And the younger you get, the more your information, the more your worldview, the more your perspective, the more your social networking, your friends, et cetera, are all keyed together electronically. So I think in some ways that's really a vital difference between the anti-Semitism that is transmitted online, and to refer back to a book title that you did, Your Father's Anti-Semitism. The anti-Semitism of previous years was in many ways adult-oriented, outside of the national state works of Nazi Germany, or that kind of enclosed system. But in the Western world, it was really an anti-Semitism that was transmitted for more or less adults or young adults, and so on. The levels of it, the ability to transmit and reach widely, that started with the internet and go on through social networks today. We have never had to cope with that kind of flood of anti-Semitic propaganda in history. It has really been a game changer. And unfortunately, it was the extremists who recognized that first and jumped to use the medium first, going back to really the early days of the internet itself, going back to the late 1980s, was the very first presence online.
While you were talking, I just typed in something. I typed in the word Holocaust denial. And the most incredible thing is I got 14,900,000 results in 0.38 seconds. In three tenths of 1 second, we got 14 million results for the word Holocaust denial, which tells us how voluminous the information is out there. And not only how voluminous it is, but how much there is, but also the fact that anybody just perusing the internet can fall upon a whole range of sites that offer Holocaust denial and distortion, and that doesn't even touch yet on anti-Semitism. I'm going to type in, while you tell us a little bit about that, I'm going to just type in the word anti-Semitism. And I would bet we get, well, let's ask the question.
It'll be overwhelming, that we know.
24,300,000 results.
We have never seen communication on this level. And communication is education in many ways. And we know, unfortunately, that there are people, particularly in this case, younger adults, sometimes young people, who've entered into the world of extremism through social media, through Google. One case, an example, if I recall correctly, was Dylan Roof, the shooter in the church in South Carolina, who began by doing a Google search for black on white crime, and that led him into and their terms of it. It's going down a certain path, because each time you go to one place and you take another step forward and ask for more information, you get sucked in deeper and deeper and deeper. Literally from the image from Alice in Wonderland down the rabbit hole. And eventually some people can't extricate themselves. Some people find themselves committed to it and committed to courses of action that end up in violence. This is, again, something that we just never had to deal with before, never had to confront with before. In the past, the neo-Nazi, the Klan member, if they wanted to transmit their material, they had to get out there physically and do it. They had to hand out the material. They had to plant it in libraries. They had to do their demonstrations or whatever. Here, it's just a totally different world where people can be anonymous. People can be, create all sorts of environments and networks. They empower each other. They lead into each other. They can hide behind pseudonyms. They can, really just use indirect influences. One of the most potent signifiers today, anti-Semitic signifiers online, are the triple parentheses called the echoes around a name or a description. If you're saying they, or a name of a person, and it's in these triple echoes, that means that they're Jews, and it's used in a anti-Semitic sense constantly. But no place does the word Jew appear there. So it bypasses a lot of the filters that are set up, a lot of the safeguards that are set up. And yet, if you know what it is, it's a clear indication. We see it now, for example, with a lot of the disinformation that's going on about Ukraine, blaming, quote, Jewish figures, Blinken or things like that. But for, what's happening in Ukraine, or in relation to COVID, there's a huge amount of anti-Semitic material linked to COVID out there. And again, some of it never is overt. but uses this kind of signifier that bypasses, concerns or gatekeeping.
So we all know, and by the way, we are now benefiting from the internet by this discussion today. You're in New York, I'm in Los Angeles. We're speaking to a group from all over the world. We have people from Miami, so we are benefiting from it. But we also see that this is a weapon that can be abused. What would you advise the Jewish community to do about this? And what are the possibilities as well as the dangers?
Well, I think one of the things is first of all, we're aware of what's out there now. It took a long time, I think, for the message to get across that there is a problem online. You mentioned that I've been researching this since published in 2001. Actually, I've been researching it for a number of years before that, even a decade before that. And it began, if you go all the way back to 1984 or so. All right. I'm going to try to make you a little louder because I'm even having trouble hearing. But all right, is that okay?
Yeah.
All right. So the question is, what can we do about it? And what I was saying is that first step was recognition. And it took a long time since we first became aware of this problem in the mid 1980s. And again, it wasn't that we were geniuses in recognizing it ourselves. It was in monitoring neo-Nazis and people like that at that time. They led us to this new form of technology, which was the old dial-up BBS systems, the early days of it, and so on. We could talk about that if anyone's interested. But it was following that, there were certain significant sort of steps in the way. One of them was 1995, when Stormfront, which was the first, a lot of people date that as the first real neo-Nazi website, came out. It was created by an associate of David Duke, who was actually living in Florida for a long time. And that became the first and most popular one for a long time. And then the events of 9/11 also spurred an immense rise in extremist and terrorist activity online. And we see these differences where social media became the next step because it broke down the barriers. It removed editorial control over content that was being posted, and it's user-driven content now. So you began being able to post your own material without sending it to someone else for approval or posting it, which of course led into Facebook and TikTok and the situation that we have today. So really what's happened is that the material has exploded in many ways. Places like Facebook, ISPs like Facebook don't even know what they're posting. They really have no knowledge sometimes of what's out there. It's just overwhelming. And to get it under control is a really difficult, perhaps even somewhat impossible job. There have been elements made and efforts made, particularly after the insurrection in January of last year by Congress, to call the leaders of Facebook and Twitter and so on to account for it. And we finally began seeing them take steps against Holocaust denial and anti-Semitism and other forms of racism and extremism and terrorism. But what happened then was a migration to a series of other social media sites that include Telegram and Gab and Getter and Parler and places like that, that pride themselves in being open for anything, where anything can go. And so we have where perhaps the largest ones are beginning to show some signs of responsibility. There are still on the fringes sites where these places proliferate and can communicate very freely, very openly with all sorts of really horrible stuff. The EU is finally beginning to move on this as well. There was an agreement last week or the last couple of weeks that looks like it's aimed at challenging some of the openness, but we run up against contrasting definitions of freedom of speech, with the European Union and European countries having a much more limited approach to the freedom of speech than the US does.
What would you expect of the people like Facebook? What should we expect? What can we do with regard to them? And let's deal with issues of anti-Semitism, issues of Holocaust denial. What are they capable of delivering? What can we legitimately ask of them?
Well, I think that what they can do is they can certainly devote more resources. Facebook, for example, has a couple of teams that are dedicated. I was in contact with Facebook on a regular basis, and we had very open meetings with them. They can devote more resources to finding out what's out there and to try to figure out how to combat it. They had a team, one based in Ireland and one based in the US, that was working on it. Clearly wasn't sufficient resources. So the first step is recognition of the problem. Second step is devoting resources to finding out the extent of the problem and so on. Third is a commitment to doing something about it. They can easily, and this is not a censorship issue in my book, because it's a private contractual arrangement between a business and a consumer. And if you ever look at those terms of agreement that people just, the boilerplate that people just check off without reading 90% of the time, there are very often standards in there that if you violate, they can take you and drop you. But they have to be serious about doing that. And part of that is, and this is where we're going to circle back to where your first question was, part of that was recognizing what is Holocaust denial and distortion, what is anti-Semitism. And there, for example, I think the IRA definitions are really useful tools in helping identify what is and what is not questionable or damaging content.
So Mark,
I think they can drop things. I think they can label things, and I think they can put up countermeasures as well.
You've asked yourself the next two questions. How would you define, or how did you define, since you were indeed its author, how did you define Holocaust denial?
Holocaust denial was the outright claim that the Holocaust never happened. It was what the Iranian government, for example, has been doing for years, and it was what some people in California in a so-called institute have been claiming for years, that the Holocaust never took place. The numbers were totally exaggerated. The gas chambers, did not kill the people that were claimed, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Holocaust distortion is quite different. Today, Holocaust distortion is much more of the problem, I think, than Holocaust denial is. Outright Holocaust denial, after Deborah Lipstadt, who I hope will really be shortly confirmed as our next special envoy in anti-Semitism, after she courageously took on David Irving in that London courtroom 20 years ago, and Irving was really totally called out by the judge as being an anti-Semite and a Holocaust denier, and so on and so forth. That banished Holocaust denial to the fringes of society in the West.
Let's interrupt you for 1 second, because some people may not have the memory. In the year 2000, David Irving sued Deborah Lipstadt essentially for a book on Holocaust denial. And essentially what happened was he self-destroyed himself, meaning that one followed the full range of his footnotes. And David Irving had been the most quotation mark scholarly of all the Holocaust deniers. And it turned out that he had misused basic historical information, misquoted, half-quoted, distorted the interpretation. And the judge found him to be both a racist and an anti-Semite and a supporter of Hitler who shaded the information in order to do that. And that put a tremendous dent in formal Holocaust denial. But now let's go to the issue of distortion.
Right. So when David Irving and his colleagues lost all shreds and claims of respectability, Holocaust denial was marginalized in the West. Holocaust distortion is much more subtle, much more sophisticated, and I actually think much more dangerous. And it is much more prevalent today in many different areas. We find it internationally in some countries where, for example, memorials are put up to national heroes who were anti-communist, let's say, but who collaborated with the Nazis. We see this in Lithuania and Hungary, places like that. We find it in places like Poland, where the number of rescuers of Jews and obviously anyone who risked their lives to rescue Jews should be remembered and held as a ray of light in a terribly dark period. But these numbers are exaggerated to create the impression that the majority of the country supported rescue, whereas we know from scholars who have come under attack and even been threatened with criminal and civil charges that the reality was there were quite a number of Polish collaborators and murderers. That is Holocaust distortion. We find it in the public eye in the United States, where elements of protesters against COVID-19 vaccination, for example, use yellow stars or claim that they are being victimized the same way that Jews were being victimized in Nazi Germany and during World War II. We find it in Hollywood, tonight's the Oscars, where movies sometimes distort the Holocaust for entertainment purposes, creating situations where in a movie a number of years ago, a woman who was implicated, who had on her conscience being involved in a murder of Jews in a burning barn. Actually, her greatest shame was that she was illiterate. And this became a feature film. So there are a number of places in popular culture and in political culture where Holocaust distortion really is much more problematic than Holocaust denial. And it's problematic because it has seeped into mainstream society, whether it's Hollywood or whether it's Washington. Whether it's Ronald Reagan laying a wreath at the grave of an SS officer in Bitburg, Germany in the 1980s, for example. All these are elements of Holocaust distortion that really undercut the horrible reality of the Holocaust.
Whether it's Vladimir Putin claiming that his task in the Ukraine was to denazify the Ukrainian government headed by a Jewish president.
Exactly. So that was where I was going to go next. What we see today is that Holocaust distortion has become a pretext for war, for an aggressive war of an invasion. And it is also used, if you recall, looking at the news clips, some of the news clips after the insurrection in Washington, one of the people participating in that insurrection was wearing a Camp Auschwitz T-shirt. And after Nancy Pelosi spoke at a news conference a couple of days later, where she talked about and focused on that T-shirt, that message. And it struck me at that point that what she was getting at, I think, whether again consciously or unconsciously, was part of the reason that the Holocaust is distorted. One of the things that all these people have in common is that it is not just the Holocaust itself, but the after effects of the Holocaust that they're attacking. And those after effects include the concepts of genocide or human rights or war crime tribunals or institutions like the United Nations or NATO or the EU, the institutions and concepts that grew up out of the Holocaust in memory of it to try to prevent it from happening again. And these were, I think, are some of the things that Holocaust distortion is also aiming at trying to undermine by undermining the narrative of and the historicity of the Holocaust itself.
So let's go back now to the second question. How does anti-Semitism manifest itself online? And what do we do about that? And how would you
define actually should not be much of a surprise.
Anti-Semitism?
Anti-Semitism manifests itself online in every way that anti-Semitism has manifested itself historically and currently. It is comparing Israel to or Zionists to Nazis. It is claiming that Israel is committing genocide. It is claiming that Jews are advocates for COVID and are responsible for spreading COVID like the Black Plague. It is claiming that Jews are behind the Great Replacement theory, meaning that Jews want to drive Westerners out of Europe and the United States. That's the rally in Charlottesville, Jews will not replace us, and replace them with people of color. It is saying that Jews are responsible for LGBT rights to weaken the fabric and morals of Western society. It is, I mean, I could go on and on, but you get the picture. Every way that anti-Semitism strikes, it is present on the internet. And this goes back to the 1980s. That original site that I mentioned from 1984 already had a library of Nazi material online. And Nazi symbolism is ubiquitous, whether it is SS symbols, whether it is Hitler, whether there is a TikTok video or videos of Himmler, the architect of the, what Richard Breitman called the architect of the final solution, the man who ran the concentration and death camp system, and have him singing all sorts of benign songs and making the Nazis into friendly people for young people to relate to. All those are present online. Games, dancing at Auschwitz. I literally can spend a half hour just narrating some of these things. How do we deal with it is very difficult and very problematic. I think one of the things that we need to do is recognize that we're probably never going to have a situation where this stuff is not available. It was always available even before the internet, and we can't put the genie back in the bottle. We're not going to get a scrubbing of the internet. So what we think we want to do and need to do are a couple of things. One is to convince the major service providers that they have to take action on it. As I said earlier, it's not a legal First Amendment issue. It's a private contractual business issue. And maybe that's something our representatives in Washington have to push more for. They listen to things coming out of Washington because they're worried about their bottom line and their own control and their own industry. Secondly, I think we have to teach our children, ourselves, that we have to be critical of information that's shared online. I'm sure we all get it especially during stress periods of, a friend sent this or a neighbor sent this. I got a story that, this happened in Washington, this happened in my state capital, this happened to my cousin in Israel, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. How often are those true? Frequently, they're not true. And we have to learn how to read between the lines and how to recognize and critically evaluate information that we get, which is, by the way, it's a life skill. We take out loans online, we buy cars online, we buy houses online, we do job interviews online. If we're going to be gullible, that's a problem all over. We have to be able to provide counter material. We have to provide factual material and content, but in a way that is attractive to the user, which means speaking the language. Videos on TikTok today may not be my generation's answer. I may be happier with a book or a scholarly refutation, but there's a place for it, and one shouldn't be ashamed of using it.
And by the way, let me give examples of that. One of the easiest things we had to fund at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum was the translation of its website into Farsi.
Mm-hmm.
And that is that we have kept up a Farsi translation of the website, and we found something quite remarkable, that whenever the Iranian government increased, most especially under our good friend Ahmadinejad, whenever it increased anti-Semitism and Holocaust denial, we found an uptick in the usage of the website. I've just been, and I know that Will Eisner has a fabulous book called The Plot, which is about, it's for scholars, it's the only time in my teaching I've ever taught a graphic novel. But one of the great graphic novelists of last generation, Will Eisner, has something called The Plot, which is a treatment of the protocols of the elders of Zion.
Now, I'll add to that, because one of the sidelines on my bio or background is that I was the scholarly consultant for a Marvel comic graphic novel called Magneto, which was the backstory of the so-called villain of the X-Men series, but he was an Auschwitz survivor, and they wanted to present it in a way that would ground it historically and accurately and sympathetically. And I agreed to do it, and I'm proud and glad that I did it. So again, it's not just speaking theoretically, but we both agreed, even graphic novels, which I shouldn't even say even, graphic novels are also a powerful form of communication and education.
But
and
the most important thing about that is we're now getting permission to translate it into Arabic. and to make it available on the net for free.
I'm glad to hear that.
And that we have to begin by thinking of what tools do we have to educate the younger generation in a language they understand, in a medium that they experience.
Exactly.
And we have to be not passive but aggressive on this, in such a way as to do it wisely and willingly and openly.
And the Seder, the Passover Seder, to refer back, is a wonderful illustration of that, because there are 4 children, all different approaches, and we're supposed to educate each one of them in the best way possible and reach each of them in the language that they speak and the language that they understand.
And we also have to educate the 5th one who's not at the table.
Correct.
Which may be in our generation the most important of the participants at the table. We have to find a way of reaching out. Talk for a moment about the definition of anti-Semitism by Ira, and also the controversy over that definition. And then I'll ask you a second question.
Well, the anti-Semitism definition, by the way, you could find, anybody who's interested can find these online. The IRA website is holocaust.remembrance.org, I think it is. International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, you Google it, and their definitions. The anti-Semitism definition, let me go back one step, and I have to add that each of these definitions, to be officially adopted by IRA, the way IRA functions, anything to be officially adopted has to be adopted by consensus, which in the diplomatic world means that everybody has to sign off. Every member at the table has to sign off on it, or, in other words, vote to accept it, vote in favor of it. If one even has reservations and withdraws, so to speak, it's dead. It hasn't gotten through. So we had to get unanimous approval of every member state of IRA for both of these definitions, which were at that time roughly 25 or so countries, maybe a little bit more. I don't remember the exact number. So these were multi-year processes that involved discussions and debate for each of them. Actually, it took about 8 years to get both of them adopted, and I had the lead responsibility in getting them through. So I could tell you that it was really almost a full-time job for these 8 years. And the reason I'm giving you the background is that some of the criticism of IRA, which we'll get to in a minute, ignore that reality. So what IRA is, it's a short block of text that basically defines anti-Semitism as a certain perception about Jews, and so on and so forth. I'm not going to go into the details of it here. It also says, following that a large or part of anti-Semitism today is targeted through criticism of the state of Israel, but criticism of Israel, like any other country, like any other democratic country, cannot be construed as anti-Semitic. It is only when it is a double standard applied to Israel that is not applied to any other democratic country that you begin to get into anti-Semitism. We don't discuss Zionism at all. We're not talking about ideology. We're not trying to police people's thoughts. We're talking about actions in it. And to illustrate that, we follow with a list of 11 examples, of which 4 or 5 of them are related to classical anti-Semitism, so to speak, and 6 or 7 focus on more Israel-oriented anti-Semitism. Some of them blur, when Israel's compared to Nazi Germany, for example, or things like that. And the reason we did that was because it was clear as we were going along that most people kind of got classical anti-Semitism, particularly in the wake of the Holocaust, and understood what we meant with that. But the questions about Israel were much more complicated. And we saw that in real time when in the summer of 2014, during another Gaza war, a synagogue in Wuppertal, Germany was firebombed. And the people who did it were arrested and confessed, and they were 2 people of Middle Eastern, perhaps Palestinian, I remember, Middle Eastern descent, and they confessed to the crime. And 2 German courts, a regular court and then appeals court, said that this was not a hate crime, but this was a protected, an act of political speech and protest. And when we realized at that point, there was the classic, we needed it, here was the perfect example. of how hates or an action aimed against Israel was, just by virtue of it being anti-Israeli, was not viewed as anti-Semitic in certain parts of the world. And we needed to educate about that. In other words, a protest in front of the synagogue we may have disagreed with and may have been distasteful or disturbing, but it was not an anti-Semitic act necessarily compared to a firebombing. So that was kind of the classic illustration of it. We also point out that context matters. What is said, how it's said, when it's said, and all that matter. IHRA's definition was adopted in the spring of 2016, and shortly after that, the United Kingdom became the first country to adopt it, and then more and more countries have followed through. It initially attracted not much attention until it began really getting this kind of success, I guess, or attention. And a number of pro-Palestinian extremist groups and very extreme progressive groups took it as a challenge to themselves and have been campaigning against IHRA. Essentially, they're really pretty small in number, with very few successes or adherents, other than, again, in some parts of the progressive academic world, and in some parts of the extreme anti-Israel world. We've had success in Muslim countries, in some of the countries in the Emirates, for example, that have adopted the Abraham Accords. The largest Muslim cleric group in the world adopted IHRA and did not see it as a threat. Muslim groups in Europe, in Great Britain, have said that they need something like IHRA to combat Islamophobia. So it's clear that what's going on there is politically motivated, but it has led to some of these extreme academics forming two new definitions, one based in the US, one based in so-called in Jerusalem. And what's fascinating to me is that they really sort of portray themselves as anti-IHRA, yet if you read them, they have a lot of good to say about IHRA. And then the only issue that they really veer from IHRA is what they claim is that IHRA has a chilling effect on Palestinian, pro-Palestinian speech. They show very few examples of it. They were made with a lack of transparent efforts. In other words, contrast to IHRA, the Jerusalem one was a small group of academics who met in secret for 2 years before coming out with their definition. And I think the Jerusalem one honestly failed last spring and summer, when we saw in Los Angeles and New York, for example, people in restaurants were targeted and threatened and asked, "Are you Jewish?" They were not asked, "Are you Zionist?" They were not asked, "Do you support what's happening in Gaza?" Or "Do you support Likud?" Or whatever. They were asked simply if you were Jewish. And that showed the need for a definition of anti-Semitism that would encompass anti-Semitism under the guise of pro-Palestinian extremism.
Mark, how optimistic are you that that the Abraham Accords and all of the events of this past, of today really, and that is, we have to look at what happened today, which is the prime ministers from Morocco, from the UAE, from Egypt, and the like, have met in the Negev with the Secretary of State of the United States, with the foreign minister. I'm talking about foreign ministers, not prime ministers.
Right.
Foreign minister of Israel. And this is an unprecedented thing. It's still an agreement of the elites, but it looks like it may transmit itself to what we call the Arab Street.
I am so encouraged and optimistic about it. And maybe we're grasping for straws a little bit, because in our work, and Michael, you do, is dealing with the subject that we deal with all the time, we tend to see a lot of the worst side of humanity, both historically and in the world. Yet it's a reminder that things can change, and there are opportunities that we get that we didn't anticipate. We didn't anticipate, for example, IHRA becoming as successful as it is, or the definitions. I never dreamed that the definitions would gain the traction that they have when it got it through. I thought they were just going to be limited to, the 25 or 30 countries that were members of IHRA, not this large international scope of it. In the Abraham Accords, I think we're seeing something that could really change history, because it begins with the elites, true, but in that part of the world, the elites dictate policy, education, and so on. And if there is genuine will to engage there, and I'm hearing rumors, as I'm sure you've heard as well, that Saudi Arabia may be embarking on a similar path, then the Saudis, for example, were the leading exporters of Wahhabism, the most violent extremist form of Islamist ideology that fueled a lot of terrorism over the last few decades. If there's a significant shift in the support or cutting off the export of that type of propaganda, of changing the textbooks and the theological approaches and the sermons and so on and so forth in the mosques, we could be seeing something that we never dreamed would be possible, which is a genuine peace in the Middle East and things spreading from there to the rest of the world in a positive vein. It's a long way between now and then, but I think for all of us who engage in this work, we are, cautiously, cynically optimistic. Cynical because we've been around and seen, what has happened, the dark side of humanity, as I mentioned earlier. But optimistic because the reality is, I don't think we would be engaging in this work if we didn't think it would have some positive impact somehow, some way. So sometimes they come from unexpected quarters, but they're perhaps even more welcome just for that.
Let's go to a different direction. Do you think this is going to have an impact on the anti-Semitism we've seen on the extreme left? Is the anti-Semitism on the extreme left fueled by the Arab world, or is it not fueled by the Arab world?
I don't think it's fueled in total by the Arab world. I think it'll be some impact, but I don't think it'll be a totally determinative result there, because a lot of anti-Semitism on the left was present historically, and comes from European, particularly from the communist world, was seeded by the communist world. And we can all go back to Marx and the controversy between him and Bauer and so on. But there's always been an anti-Semitic element in the extreme, left circles. I don't think there's anything new or hidden about that. Bebel's famous remark that anti-Semitism is socialism of fools is, I think, over 100 years old already. And that predated, obviously, the Middle Eastern issues. So I think that it's not going to be the final, closing of anti-Semitism on the left, but I think it'll take away one of the props that leftist anti-Semites use, and it'll narrow and perhaps expose them all the more for the anti-Semites that they are.
And are there any signs of optimism on the extreme right?
Honestly, none that I could see. I think the extreme right has been emboldened.
By the way, Mark, I have an absolute rule, which is when you say honestly, I dismiss everything, because I have not known you to be lying to me up till now. so
all right.
I had a wonderful conversation with my grandson this morning, and my grandson said, and we were talking about his college admissions, and my grandson said to tell the truth, and I stopped him short and I said, Jeremy, I presume you've always been telling me the truth. I haven't known you as a liar. So honestly,
so if that's the case, you should know.
I'm going to kid you. I'm going to kid you on that, Mark, because I don't think I haven't presumed you're lying at all. I'm also not quite.
So you know me well enough to know that I don't lie on these things. So it's a sense of emphasis, put it that way.
Yeah.
That the answer still, either way, either honestly or dishonestly, the answer is no. I'm not optimistic at all on that side. I think the events over the last few years, particularly in the United States, have fueled extremism in general, radicalism in general. It has become mainstream, and there are elements that find it, impossible to look at their own political circles and point out anti-Semitism and condemn anti-Semitism. So I think we're in for a rough ride here. What used to be marginalized is now mainstreamed in many cases. We have people sitting in Congress, in the US Congress, that I don't think there's any question are anti-Semitic. I don't think we would have said that 10 years ago, for example.
But I also think that we have an obligation to understand the difference between malice and stupidity and ignorance. I'll point out, and I've written extensively on this, when Whoopi Goldberg spoke about Nazi Germany's attack on the Jews not being racist, I don't think it was a statement of malice. I think it was a total statement of ignorance.
So that's where I would go back to the IRA definition that says context matters. And there you have a person who has a long history of being friendly to Jewish concerns and never expressed any anti-Semitism and so on and so forth. And you would say that, okay, where's this coming from? And in my mind, clearly it was the wrong statement, but it was coming from ignorance more than, as you put it, malice.
And let's be clear so everybody understands why it's ignorance. The Jews were defined racially in Nazi Germany. They were defined by the blood of their grandparents. And even though we can argue that Jews are not a race, they were defined racially in Nazi Germany. And the society itself was a racist society, with Jews being at the lowest, at not only the most hated of the quotation marks races, but regarded as the most dangerous. I want to go on.
Michael, if I could add one thing that I think is really important and crucial, that I think one of the things that we need to do at the same time as we just had this conversation about right, left, et cetera, I think it is really important and vital to point out that anti-Semitism has become weaponized as a political tool in a way that is destructive and counter-constructive. And I mean by that those on the right who point out anti-Semitism on the left, and those on the left who point out anti-Semitism on the right, and who neither of which confront it in their own homes or their own parties, are doing it disservice. They're making anti-Semitism into a political cliche and devaluing it, where the reality is that we need to recognize it on both sides and have those who identify with each side take the step and lead in doing what is necessary to call it out and erase it from their circle.
You and I have both been arguing with our friends that those on the right must be vigilant in criticism of anti-Semitism on the right, and those on the left must be equally vigilant in criticism of anti-Semitism on the left, and both must resist the temptation to call the other guy out.
Right.
In other words, whatever credibility you have, right or left, it's your own that you should be attacking on this. I want to go.
Anti-Semitism should never be a political football. And one thing of optimism that I will say, and oddly enough, it's an example that comes from Washington, is that there is in the Senate, for example, a task force on anti-Semitism that is led by Jackie Rosen, Senator Jackie Rosen, a Democratic woman from Nevada, and Senator Jim Lankford, a Republican senator from Oklahoma, and they work tremendously closely together. It's bipartisan. There are counterparts in the House with Ted Deutsch, who's departing. We'll miss him tremendously in the House, but he's going to do a great job at AJC. And Chris Smith from New Jersey, a Republican who's been involved in this for 20 years at least. And oddly enough, of all places, Washington offers this bipartisan example of how to deal with anti-Semitism that I wish more people would know and model.
I want to touch on one point from the Jerusalem Declaration. I put it in the chat. It's number 14 on the Declaration because it says something for me that I find deeply, it's a sleight of hand. It says political speech does not have to be measured, proportionate, tempered, or reasonable to be protected under Article 19 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, or Article 10 of the European Convention on human rights and other human rights instruments. Criticism that some may see as excessive or contentious or reflecting a double standard is not in and of itself anti-Semitic. In general, the line between anti-Semitic and non-anti-Semitic speech is different from the line between unreasonable and reasonable speech. And the reason I find it as a sleight of hand is because they don't ask the question, why, first of all, political speech can all be protected. Nobody's been arguing that. The question has been, what happens when it's neither measured nor proportional, nor tempered nor reasonable? Where's that coming from?
Right. I think JDA was afraid or chose not to, for political reasons, to confront the presence of anti-Semitism in extreme progressive anti-Israel, anti-Zionist circles. I think that they, for whatever reason, and there's a range of people who signed JDA, and some of them, you could say this and I could say this, some of them are our friends who signed on to it, and people we respect. And I know at least one or two of them have had second thoughts about it already. But I think there was a sense of not reading IRA carefully, responding to IRA through the lens of its critics. And a lot of these critics, as I mentioned, were motivated and came from the extremist, circles. I think that IRA is not perfect. I could give you, for example,
Mark, to be fair to IRA, and I hate to be fair to you, to be fair to IRA, you say it's a working definition, which means that the imperfections are in process of being ironed out over time.
Actually, no. I'm gonna here. There are two definitions of a working definition. That's one of them. The other one, and this is one of the things I wanted to get to. IRA is not an academic definition. IRA is meant as a practical, hands-on definition for policymakers, for educators, for people in the broad, judges and law enforcement, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It is not an academic definition. If you were doing an academic definition, again, we know that the great medievalist from Stanford in the 20th century, Gavin Longmuir, had a book called Toward a Definition of Anti-Semitism, in which after a whole career of working on this, he still was working towards a definition. Academics do that. I get that. And if I was doing a seminar on the historiography of anti-Semitism, there are 20 different definitions we could play with: theological, historical, sociological, philosophical, et cetera, et cetera. IRA is none of those. And that's one of the things that I think contrasts with JDA, where its introduction is, if I recall, 3 or 4 pages long and very academic in tone. And that would fail the test, because that's not what IRA is referring to. IRA's working definition is a definition that can be used in a practical sense. Mark,
we're going to close to wrap up, but I want to take a couple of questions from the audience and from our participants. Mallory S. asks, how can we combat the anti-Israel, anti-Semitic comments on social media by people like the Hadid sisters and others whose followers number more than the Jewish population in the world? Whether comments come from malice, ignorance, or stupidity, quote Dr. Berenbaum, many of their followers believe what they say and repeat it.
Yeah, I think we're dealing with, I'm not sure who the sisters are that are being referred to. I'm not sure if it's I think with actresses, models, or something like that. Is that who she's referring to? I don't know. I think one of the things is that we should not be afraid to speak up, to call out things that are wrong. Clearly, there are going to be disagreements sometimes. We're not going to agree politically on issues related to Israel or issues related to the United States sometimes. And there has to be room for disagreement to be okay. But again, when they cross that line of the double standard or the legitimization of Israel, calling for the destruction of Israel, whether coded or overtly, then we have to be ready to stand up to it. And we find allies. I recall there was that controversy over the Women's March a couple of years ago when there were a number of people involved with it who had embraced Louis Farrakhan. And then a number of others, the founders, including the early figureheads of the movement of the march, like Alyssa Milano, I remember, the actress, stood up and basically said, no, we can't be a part of this because of the Farrakhan connection. and they published and made a huge difference. And I think there are those kind of role models and people in those kind of positions that have to speak up. Again, to go back to classical Judaism, we just finished Purim, and what Mordechai said to Esther. Maybe that's the reason you're in a position of prominence. You have to speak up and do something about it.
Mallory has clarified these are the models.
Right. I thought
these women are the models.
I will say, by the way, that there's also, in my mind, perhaps maybe models should not have so much influence with the world. That's a topic for a different discussion, and I know I'm dating myself tremendously when I say that. But there are other people who certainly should.
We also have to say that we have to work with influencers.
Correct.
And
I referred to an actress as a positive example, a counter example.
And we need influencers to speak up and to speak out, and not to take it. There's an interesting book called Jews Don't Count, which is on the avoidance of all of that. We're asked by Sherry Goldman, how do we handle organizations like Amnesty International?
I think Amnesty International is actually, discrediting themselves and again, I think it needs to be pointed out constantly that Amnesty's record in the past few years, and I'll include Human Rights Watch in that regard as well, has been so consistently anti-Israel that it is difficult to take anything they say, certainly related to the Middle East, as unbiased. And the fact that they finally exposed themselves and outed themselves, at least through their US director, actually may help us in the long run. The State Department had a very strong and clear reaction to it. And in no unequivocal terms, they denounced it. And I think we need to push back and basically say that something like Amnesty cloaked itself in moral prestige. They've lost that moral prestige by being bigoted and anti-Semitic in their statements. That needs to be hammered home. We don't have to accept their legitimacy, but we need to counter it with facts. And having the facts to counter it is extremely important in any argument. Emotional responses don't carry that much weight sometimes, and can be counterproductive. Use the tools, whether it's TikTok or whether it's a Facebook video or whatever. You will use the tools that are out there to get our message across, but we don't have to accept what anybody else said either.
Let's touch on one more. One of our listeners, Sherry, our audience, Sherry Goldman Gottlieb says, even Zelensky was an amazing and Jewish lauded Ukraine for saving Jews when appealing to the Knesset. We have to be careful again, because the Ukrainians were also participants in the Holocaust in a very important way. We've had a long session on that. They were people who staffed the camps of Treblinka and Belzec. They also were people who staffed the liquidation of the Warsaw Ghetto during the uprising and its aftermath. So the Ukrainians have a deeply mixed record. That doesn't impact whatsoever on our understanding of what's happening today. Mark, this has been, as always, a wonderful conversation. I'm going to turn it back to Nikki with gratitude to you and with deep appreciation for your ongoing work and for the clarity and succinctness of your vision. So thank you, Mark, and as always, a pleasure.
Thank you for the opportunity to be here, for your questions, for your friendship. Thanks for those who asked excellent questions in the chat. I'm sorry we didn't get to more of them, and I apologize for the technical difficulties on my end earlier.
Not a problem. Thank you both so much. We really appreciate having both you, Michael, and you, Mark, here with us this week. And so I just wanted to conclude by reminding everyone here that we have our 4th event in the series next Sunday on April 3rd, also at 7:30 p.m. We'll be discussing anti-Semitism in Western Europe with Dr. Gilbert Kahn and again, the fabulous Michael Berenbaum. So thank you all for taking some time out of your Sunday evening and listening to this really interesting and important conversation. Thank you, stay safe, and have a good rest or have a good week. Thank you, bye.
Bye.